Please welcome to the stage Mickey Tripathi.
Good morning. Thanks for coming back. Had a really great first day, thanks to all of you. We're really excited and feel a lot of excitement from being here in person. So thank you, everyone, for joining us and for participating and making it a great first day. Today we're going to talk about a lot of stuff. But there's a focus in a number of sessions on AI. And so what I thought I would do this morning is just give a little bit of a broad context on AI as we're thinking about it in the administration and across the department. And then as we move into some sessions this morning and this afternoon, we'll be doing deep dives into questions of like AI and bias, how the FDA looks at that, how the ONC rule treats that, and then we'll be doing even a deeper dive this afternoon on the ONC rule itself and all the nitty-gritty details of that. So start very broad and wide, and we're going to go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. There was an executive order that was issued. Hopefully most of you saw that, a 100-page executive order on AI on October 30th, I think, which covered a lot of different areas. Core principle was, how do we establish trust? Right? It was about saying we need to seize the promise and manage the risks, and that's a big and. We want to seize the promise, but we have to manage the risks. And I think, we as Deputy Secretary had said, I guess she was quoting me, so I'm now quoting her, quoting me, that, we at the department are AI optimists. And certainly as you look at the rule and you see these things just on the discussion about guardrails, we always focus a lot on the guardrails, which might give an impression that we're not optimists, but we are, actually. It's just about saying, let's establish the guardrails because we want this to work, and we want it to work safely and in a way that doesn't, have some setbacks or things that we live to regret. So the executive order, if you look at that, there are, obviously it's across the entire federal government, but the Department of Health and Human Services has a significant portion of the executive order. The Department of Commerce, Department of Energy, Department of Health and Human Services, I think, are the three big agencies. And then obviously there's a whole bunch of other stuff, with other agencies. But there's a pretty significant portion there that's the Department of Health and Human Services. So it's really important for us in the department. One of the things that Secretary Becerra has tasked me and the super talented Dr. Syed Mohideen, who is the counselor to the Deputy Secretary, with doing is co-leading a task force, an HHS task force on AI. So that's, we actually started that before the executive order process started. So we were already thinking about that in the department of, launching a department-wide task force, recognizing that there's a whole bunch of stuff already going on in the department, and a need for, a better sort of departmental perspective on the great activities that are already going on, but really, sort of saying we need to be a little bit proactive here in how we think about this across all of the operating divisions and the staff divisions. Excuse me. So that, that process was just getting underway, and then the executive order process started, and if you look at the executive order, you see there is a very specific call out to the launching of a task force, by the department. So we did launch that just this month, a couple of weeks ago. So that's underway now across all the operating divisions and staff divisions. So there's going to be a lot more to come as we think about that. Some of the core principles, as we look at across the department, as it relates to AI, are as I said, it's within the department. How do we seize the promise and manage the risks? Because there are a number of things going on in the department already fantastic things. The FDA, for example, has already approved almost 700 AI-enabled software as a medical device devices, and they're working on predetermined change control plan approach to AI-enabled devices. On Wednesday, a Republican congressman from the Department of Energy and Commerce noted that as he is going around the country talking to people about AI, one of the things that he hears over and over again is that the FDA is totally on top of it. is doing a fantastic job in keeping up with the market and staying at the forefront of everything we're doing. So, for those who sort of feel like, oh, we're behind, I guess the thing that I always like to point out is we're all behind, all of us. And anyone who thinks that they're not, and even when you go talk to the big tech companies, they'll kind of tell you they're learning something new every single day as they're diving into it. So I don't know that any one of us or any particular group is behind. We're all learning. We're all trying to sort of say, how do we establish these these guardrails to allow that that innovation to keep going. But we also have National Institutes of Health who are working in partnership with the Department of Energy to establish, to plan and develop critical components of the national AI research resource infrastructure that the executive order calls for piloting, and then there's sort of further work to build that kind of nationwide infrastructure that I think all of us appreciate, that we need to have the public piece of this, a whole bunch of, all the investment, when you look at, not all, but a significant portion of the investment in these, big LLM models and other kind of frontier models has been on the private sector side. And, I think we feel pretty strongly that the public sector side needs investment as well as we think about that, to make sure that it's available to all, stakeholders, not just those who can afford, sort of the higher, the higher priced or the, the more well-resourced organizations. So that's a, critical part of it. The Office of Civil Rights issued draft regulations emphasizing that AI-enabled tools they fall under the Affordable Care Act, Section 1557, non-discrimination provisions. Just because it's an AI-enabled tool doesn't sort of alleviate anyone of the responsibility for making sure that it's not discriminatory. At the end of the day, you need to have people who are making the decisions about what comes out of that tool, and then how am I applying it to a patient. So that's a really important provision as well. CMS has also issued rules regarding the use of AI-enabled tools in Medicare Advantage medical necessity decisions, as well as coverage determinations. So again, another example, in 2024, they're going to begin audit and oversight of those and other kinds of practices among Medicare Advantage plans as a part of, sort of rolling out, sort of early approaches to how we're thinking about AI. So a lot of activity already underway. But then we've got the task force now that we're launching. That's going to cover 8 areas, because the Department of Health and Human Services covers an amazingly broad expanse of sort of the healthcare delivery and the healthcare value chain. So we're going to be looking at research, drug and device development and evaluation, healthcare and human services, public health, critical infrastructure, biosecurity, biosafety, and ethical considerations like privacy and other ethical considerations. And then finally, internal operations. Those are kind of the 8 areas that the task force that we're now rolling out. We've got work groups. Right now, it's an internal task force, but we will develop an approach to be able to get private sector input, because we really need private sector input in this, and we recognize that. We just need to get our own sort of house in order here of, let's get our process started, and then, and then we'll figure out that, the best way to get that private sector input and, sort of the bi-directional discussion of this, because this really does have to be public-private, I think, as all of us appreciate. But I wanted to give you that broad frame to, give you a sense of, what the executive order covers. What are the important parts of that? How does that relate to the department and what we're doing across the department as the context for the deeper discussion that we're going to have now as it relates to specifically AI and bias in particular? What are the considerations there that we all need to take into account? And then, as I said, diving deeper into the rulemaking that we have as well. So hopefully that gives you a sort of a broad perspective on the ways we're thinking about this, and I think I am giving back time to the next set of speakers.
Good morning, everybody. Morning. Hello. Good morning. One more time in the back. Can't hear you. Thank you. Oh, nice. All right, great. Wow. Okay, fantastic. All right. My name is Dan Gorenstein. I am the founder and executive editor of Tradeoffs. We are a national nonprofit health policy news organization. If you know us, you probably know our podcast, which is called Tradeoffs. We also produce digital articles and send out a weekly newsletter. Across all of those platforms, our mission is to help health policy decision makers, people like all of you in this room, have smarter, more honest conversations about health policy. We do that by combining research, data, evidence, and human storytelling. Think the New York Times upshot, married and had a kid with This American Life. That's us. This summer, we produced a two-part series on racial bias in healthcare AI. And ever since that reporting, AI's place in healthcare's consciousness, as you all know, has continued to grow. One survey found 32% of hospital chief information officers said AI and machine learning are the top health IT priorities this year. That's up from just 6% in 2022. Another analysis projected that the AI healthcare market will grow from around $20 billion this year to nearly $200 billion by the end of the decade. There's growing excitement that artificial intelligence can make care better, speed it up, improve diagnoses, ease the burden on a burned out workforce. But of course, and I bet a lot of people feel this in this room, there is skepticism. A Medscape survey from October found that 2 out of 3 physicians are concerned about AI driving diagnosis and treatment decisions. There are also concerns that these powerful new tools will perpetuate bias and inequity that has long been baked into the US healthcare system. Few people, if anyone, want healthcare AI to be biased. Like, raise your hand if you're like, yeah, I want that to be biased, right? I mean, nobody wants that. But in talking with developers and researchers, for us as journalists, not really knowing that much about this, it became abundantly clear this summer to us just how hard it is, or how easy it is for bias to slip into these algorithms. And it seems like it's only going to be possible to avoid that if everyone in the chain, developers, health system leaders, bedside clinicians, are paying attention and actively trying to mitigate bias. And now, federal regulators are starting to get involved, right? Many of you know this, but just yesterday, the administration announced that more than 24 healthcare providers and payers have agreed to work towards responsible AI use. And the 3 agencies that we're going to get to hear from today, FDA, ONC, and the Office of Civil Rights, are all either working on or have introduced new guidance and regulations that seek to reduce racial bias in healthcare AI. Let's be clear, let's be honest about this. Cutting-edge regs with cutting-edge technology, there will be problems. We know this. There will be unintended consequences. That's not because people are not wanting to do a good job, but this is a first shot at this. This is going to be hard. So over the next couple of hours, we're going to hear from top officials from those 3 agencies, talk with industry leaders about their visions and their plans for how to make and pull this incredibly important task off. I want to be really clear. These conversations are not going to be confrontational. They're not going to be controversial. We are not like doing some ONC version of Crossfire. Instead, we're going to have honest, thoughtful engagement. These sessions are designed to anticipate some of the most immediate pitfalls and explore how regulators and the regulated entities can collaborate to avoid those pitfalls and ensure what everyone in this room and probably in our country wants: a future that leverages the power of AI, right? And it improves health equity. All 3 of the conversations will be driving towards the same big question: how can regulators and those that they regulate support the creation and use of AI while protecting against biased algorithms? Before we get into our first conversation, I want to take the pulse of the room. And I'd like you all to pull out your phones, because we've got a poll question. And I don't like saying this word out loud, no offense to this company, but Hoova, that's just a weird word. Feels a little dirty. So if you could open up the Whova app, please, and on the home page, you're going to see a button that says Polls. Click on Polls. Scroll to the bottom. I'm trying to go slow. Scroll to the bottom and tap on the second to last question, which should say, are you confident that federal agencies and industry can work together on AI regulation that fosters innovation and protects against bias? Yes, no, unsure. That question one more time. Are you confident that federal agencies and industry can work together on AI regulation that fosters innovation and protects against bias? At the end of the 3 sessions, I will ask you again to see if there's been any changes, and I'm gonna open up my Whova app right now to check this. Polls. All right, going down. Cool. Yes. Okay. So we have, anybody need more time to vote? People still voting? Yes, no? Anybody still voting? Raise your hand, you're still voting? No? Okay, done. All right, so we've got yes, there are 111 yeses, there are 50 noes, there are 90 unsures. So we're going to see at the end of these 3 sessions if that's changed at all. Hopefully it has, but we'll see, and we'll see how it changes. Maybe you guys will be less confident. Let's see what these regulators have to say. Okay. Before we go to our first session, I want to just take a minute. This is a really important conversation. It's great. This technology could be great. It could be amazing. It could actually help level the playing field for people who have not been treated fairly for long, long periods of time. Or this technology could further entrench the inequity that has existed for a long, long period of time. It is amazing, I will say on a personal level, to be here with you all this morning, to engage in real, honest, not confrontational, but constructive conversations about how to do something that is inspiring, that is awesome, that is important. And I just want to thank ONC for having us here, and I want to thank you all for engaging, helping us. It's not just going to be what happens on stage. Hopefully you guys are going to have questions. Hopefully you guys are going to have thoughts. And hopefully these conversations that happen today, you will bring them back to wherever you go, and it will inform how this works. But we have to come together and pull this off. This really matters. And so it is really an honor to be a part of conversations that really matter. So I want to thank everybody here for helping participate in that. Okay, enough of that. Thank you. Let's bring up Troy and Suchi, if you guys could come on up on the stage. Thanks very much. And let's give a hand to Troy and Suchi. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Could you guys just introduce yourselves? Troy, let's start with you.
I'm Troy Tasbas. I am the Director for Digital Health Center of Excellence at FDA. It's good to be here, and I want to thank ONC for having us, but also the ongoing kind of connection that they're making with the industry. I think this has been very important, and I've been very happy to hear that coming from the industry side about how we're proactively engaging. So great job, fantastic job. Thank you.
Suchi.
I'm Suchi Saria. I wear a few different hats. I'm founder, CEO of Bayesian Health, which is a clinical AI platform company. It delivers point-of-care solutions to augment frontline caregivers at health systems to build solutions that anticipate life-threatening complications, identifying them early and preventing them and improving human health, like saving patient lives, cutting financial waste. I'm also an AI researcher. I've worked in the field for a little over 20 years and hold a position at Hopkins. I'm a faculty there leading a number of efforts around AI and health.
Great, thank you guys. Troy, first question to you. Unlike ONC and OCR, who we're going to hear from in a little bit, FDA does not currently have new regulations proposed on bias and AI, but I know this is something that the agency is thinking about a lot. It's a priority for the agency, and that you personally are thinking about a lot. So can you set the table? What is FDA seeing out there in the wild that concerns you about racial bias and AI?
Yeah, that's a good question. And by the way, Dan initially started that he was trying to find smart and honest people, and then honestly, the two of those didn't exist. So we have the smart and the honest, which is, which is the irony. I'm a federal official,
and a comedian,
and a comedian, evidently. So I'm, trying out for my next gig. I think there's two issues that we're seeing right now. One is FDA has, generally speaking, have looked at bias considerations when we're evaluating medical products. So we already have that muscle to essentially evaluate products as they're coming in. Now with AI, it tends to be slightly different. And what we've been seeing in the industry is not necessarily malicious reasons or purpose of developing a product with bias considerations, but more around not having the discipline to introduce bias into the development practice, in the sense that how do you actually address bias from the very early stages of when you're thinking about a product development and throughout the life cycle? Because one thing that is currently certain is that bias is really introduced in so many different points. So what we all hear traditionally is like, oh, make sure your data is representative. But the reality is that if you're asking the wrong question to begin with as a hypothesis to train the model, you immediately introduce bias to the equation. And then the other part that we're also more concerned about is not necessarily during the product development, but after the product is deployed. How do you ensure that bias is not coming into the product itself, the model itself, as it's learning more and more new things through the data that it's being introduced to it? So, our focus has been really thinking about this thing and my background was engineering, so I didn't really start the problem statement with a policy in mind. I started with more of an engineering centricity in mind. So the thing that we started talking about was, well, how do we ensure that we understand the entire life cycle of an artificial intelligence product, right? Make sure that you differentiate between predictive AI and generative AI. And then you have to start actually going down the list of all of the different milestones that are achieved when a product is being developed, including once the product is released into the market itself in production. And so what we've been really focused on, and this is through also discussions with the legislators, is that, FDA traditionally has focused on more the pre-market authorization, and generally speaking, why we focused on that is because products didn't evolve once it was released, right? These laws were developed when they had hardware devices in mind, and so what we've been really trying to talk about is that the post-market performance monitoring is becoming much more important to address and weed out the bias issues as a model is learning something new.
Can you just one quick follow-up on that, Troy? This post-market watching. Even if it's hypothetical, can you give us an example of the kind of thing that the FDA is afraid of?
Well, one is it's not hypothetical. And yesterday, Suchi and I had a fairly lengthy conversation around the technical and operational discipline that we really have to introduce into the environment. The post-market monitoring, and it's kind of analogous to anyone who's ever done software development and release understands that you don't deploy software without having monitoring tools associated to that to ensure that it's performing as intended. You are able to identify when something is going wrong. You're able to remediate that. Well, the problem that we've been seeing with artificial intelligence is that it's still being thought of as a data science experiment, and not necessarily something that you have to really think through around the operations of how do you actually manage the life cycle once it's deployed into the market. So the post-market monitoring is really around things like taking this concept, this abstract concept like data drift, and actually creating mathematical equations and computational models to be able to essentially see when data drift is happening. So
Not if.
Not if, when, right? And then you have to determine, like, so when people talk about data drift, and Suchi could probably talk about this much more as she's developing these products, you ask the question, well, when does data drift happening? Is it a percentage? Is it associated to a risk? Is it a parameter that you have to build into the product that you can actually adjust as based on the risk of the product itself? And so we really have to get down to those type of engineering level discussions and start kind of coming down from this abstract concept of data drift and bias to now we can actually measure when something is biased compared to what it was intended to do, the product.
And so that's more that's later on in the life cycle. Let's talk about the earlier part of the life cycle. What's one concrete thing the FDA is doing, Troy, to combat the problem of racial bias in AI?
Well, so we start with all products. We evaluate the data was used to train the model itself. And so that is actually, I mean, as Mickey mentioned, we approved so far about 700 or so products, but generally speaking, these were all lock systems. They were all predictive AI models, generally speaking for more of a radiology and cardiology. It's 87% of the products that we've approved so far have been in those two areas. And one of the questions that we ask in evaluation is the data that was used, essentially, and what is the intended population? Does it match the intended population that was used? Now, we have to go deeper into this, and one of the problems that Suchi and I really talk about often is that there is this AI developers start with the data that they have, and they train a model instead of looking at what problem am I trying to address. And so there is that mental shift that we have to do as a market, as an industry, to start with the problem statement and then go acquire the data that is going to essentially address the question that you're asking. And so that's a very important shift that we have to make. And again, that's why I said there has to be this transition from more of a data science project to, hey, I'm actually building enterprise-grade technologies and have to think about the integration and the ongoing operations of these technologies once it's deployed into the market itself, like in a production environment. And production is a healthcare system at this point.
Suchi, jump in, please.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit sort of going one level deeper, being on the other side from the FDA, watching the process a little bit.
Being the regulated.
Being the regulated. To me, it's been very interesting and frankly exciting to see how thoughtful the FDA has been, much more so than, the lay street parlance is, oh my gosh, AI is here, we don't have a rubric, we don't know. But I think that's often happening in a lot of other areas of AI where there isn't, when you're looking at medical devices or clinical, there's often the starting point is very scientifically led. And as a result, the choice of methods that are being used is pretty rigorous to start. And so, for instance, from the FDA's point of view, what we have to demonstrate is that in the clinical studies we're doing, we're measuring performance on different subgroups, like different racial, and these could be age-based, these could be based on gender, race, but also things like, maybe people with certain comorbid conditions. And so you really are trying to do a couple different things there. One is basically showing that your clinical study has diverse enough data that you're able to, reasonably draw conclusions. The other piece of this is measuring performance on subgroups. And then I think you started this whole thing with what I felt was a super exciting and audacious goal, which is can regulators and regulated, the industry, work together to really come to where we need to be versus where we are. And speaking in this area, I see sort of opportunities for some big gaps that need to be filled. And so if it's okay, I can, I want to speak to one.
No, I very much want you to speak to one. Just so everybody in the room knows, we've had like 27 background calls to prep for this. So I've been pushing these guys to like not give, like they're super smart as we all know, but I've been pushing them to like be specific and concrete and tell stories because we want everybody in the room to be following along and engaged. So let's just tell it. That's
Not the traditional, it depends.
Right. We don't need sort of talking op-eds up here. We want stories. We want stories. So Suchi, can you back up for a quick second before you talk about the process and tell the process story? Can you just tell us a little bit about the one specific product that you are making that could have racial bias in it unintentionally? But just tell us, what is that product? And more, before we even get into the racial bias piece, let's talk about why that product is important and why it matters and why you're excited about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've done nearly 8 to 10 years of research in this area called sepsis. It's one of the leading causes of hospital deaths. It is essentially a scenario where an infection, when the body's immune system is reacting to an infection, but it overreacts to a point where it starts attacking your different organ systems, and it accelerates often very quickly, and if it goes unrecognized and untreated in a timely fashion, within a matter of hours and days, you can die. I lost my nephew to sepsis, so I got to experience this firsthand. And when I first started doing research in this area, like now nearly 10 years ago, one of the most interesting insights I saw coming into the space as an AI researcher was the enormous opportunity for AI to make a difference. And how? Basically, when you look at sort of, the EMR, a lot of data, the labs, vitals, clinical history, there's a lot of data already being collected. And if you're able to, in real time, monitor that data, so today we think about a lab test. Often a physician is suspecting something, so they're running a lab test. But what if instead we had an alternative reality where there are systems that could be reading the data that is already getting collected in our EMRs, parsing them through AI algorithms that could then, in the background, look for these signs and symptoms and risk factors and then flag these patients, drawing attention to patients when they're in their critical moments that we shouldn't be missing. And then how do you do this in a way so that then you make it really easy for the care teams to then evaluate? It needs to be, if you can do it transparently, then all you're really doing is drawing attention, and then the care team can come in, run the traditional diagnostic process they would, but now you're making sure this patient wasn't missed. They can go through like ordering additional labs if needed, diagnose, evaluate, and then treat. And that's an example area. And we've done early studies that show in real world settings dramatic opportunity for improving, reducing mortality, reducing morbidity, reducing length of stay, and reducing a number of other key outcomes that are so beneficial, not obviously for the patient, but also, as we know, we live in a world where there are many stakeholders that matter, and we need the hospital systems benefit, we as a country benefit from improving outcomes, but also like reducing the cost of caring for these patients, the unnecessary cost that comes out of like them becoming sicker and then needing more intensive resources to care for.
And I just want to put a really fine point on this. If this tool had been in place and had worked, your nephew may be alive.
As a scientist, the counterfactual is a hard thing.
I know.
But
You're counterfactuals. I know, it's so frustrating. But yes, but right?
I mean, honestly, like, it motivates me every day when I see data flowing through the system, and I can see the real impact that tools like this can have. So it's not a hypothetical conversation to me. It is not a conversation about, wouldn't it be cool? Or should I stand up on stage? Or like, can we sound smart, talking about smart sounding things? This is very real. So I think when I hear about AI and regulation, for me, this is very real in terms of what is it going to do to us and what is it going to do, the impact we can be driving today. And as a scientist, having worked at the forefront in like developing these tools, deeply understanding the technology, advancing it, and also having written and worked extensively in the areas of drift shift monitoring and bias monitoring, I feel like we do have tools in the field that are state-of-the-art that can be deployed today to do this right and do this well. So it's exciting to see what's possible, but then also sort of the anxiety of like, things being done to us as opposed to with us.
Great, and thank you for that setup. And so this is what you've done is tell us that you've given us the case for why AI is exciting, why AI could really make a difference in a very positive way. Now walk us through, please, this process where you were wanting to get to a couple of minutes ago around what it has actually been like to be regulated by the FDA with one of these products. And so just tell us what that product is and tell us that story, please.
So I'll do two quick stories. The first story is one that you've never heard, but is entirely inspired by the conversations I heard this morning. So ideally, what we'd want is something like this, where a tool developer is able to go collect data and develop the tool, like learn, train, and so on. But then what really matters is when they're doing a clinical study to validate the tool, we're able to find sufficiently diverse, data sets on which we can evaluate. However, we don't put a burden on the developers to say, you need to have had data that it represents the full nation. You need to have data that represents international countries. You need to have had data that represents very, very small subgroups. Instead, what you want is to basically have the tool come with a very rigorous process attached to it that says, I understand how the tool performs in different subgroups. I understand how the tool performs live. I understand how the tool performance changes as surprises happen. For example, when we did our studies, these were big studies that came out last year in the cover of Nature Medicine. These were 3 big manuscripts, again, so that there was transparency around the work, the rationale, the evaluations. And one of the things in those studies were these were like across 5 different hospitals, academic community hospitals over 2.5 years. And we hadn't anticipated COVID was going to happen, but it happened. And so in the middle of the study, you're starting to see COVID patients. But because the system was instrumented with monitors for drifts and shifts and tuning, it was fascinating to see how we were able to stay performant through COVID and stay performant as we move from one site to the next to the next. So this is all to say this is very possible. It's very doable. But this is very different from today's infrastructure, where a lot of the burden on the developer is in the early part where they're being asked to do a lot. And then what that means is you're basically sitting there on a piece of technology that could be having an impact and making positive change. You're basically in a lab setting for years just trying to surmount many of the challenges of this data and that data, instead of kind of focusing on a very rigorous engineering process that allows you to demonstrate evidence, but fully well know that whatever evidence you demonstrate ultimately is still limited. And what you really need is a good, rigorous process so that when you're now out in the real world, you have the ability to continuously monitor, identify, and tune. And that's, I think, what would be super exciting. So I think the FDA's PCCP is a vehicle for doing that.
Wait. So
if we can get there.
You just use an acronym that perhaps everybody in the room doesn't know.
Mickey educated us on it earlier. But it's the predetermined change control plan. So what it does is basically gives device makers a way by which they can agree with the FDA up front on a plan for how are they going to monitor, how are they going to tune, what are they going to look for over time, so that essentially, rather than saying every time you make a change to your device, you need to come back to the FDA and submit something that needs approval, which is an extremely slow and onerous process and very expensive. Instead, now, if we can align with you an overall process, you now essentially can run that process and effectively you maintain rigorous documentation to make sure you've done what you've done. And that now allows you to accelerate this ability to stay performant.
And Suji, can you just very, very quickly, because I want to get to Troy to be able to talk about from the FDA perspective, can you just walk the crowd through what happened when you had your product? What did you feel from your perspective was helpful and useful about the FDA review process? And what did you, when and where in the process did you feel like things broke down or were not as effective?
So the part that was really helpful is sort of the very rigorous.
What product was this, though?
So this is, for example, for our sepsis product, as an example. So the part that is helpful is the rigorous scientific process of very clearly thinking about what is your intended use, what is the intended population, You know, what is the data you're going to use for the clinical study? How are you going to measure what you're going to measure? What are your endpoints? Making sure there's no, like your process is sound, your study is sound, and the data and conclusions you're going to draw from it are reliable. So, and you're effectively using this process to argue through what is the benefit, what are the risks, what is the risk mitigation process, you know, how do you do software development, end-to-end testing, life cycle. So that's exciting. It's exciting to see that, you know, that gives me comfort. I mean, that we're doing it, but I like that everybody else is doing it. I want to know that, like...
You want that outside confirmation.
Yeah. I want to know that the devices that are being used are, you know, or any solutions that are being used, people are thoughtful and they're investing the energy. Okay. Again, as someone who's worked in this area for a long time and as a researcher thinks a lot about what is rigorously the right thing to do, that appeals to me. It makes me happy that it's not broken. So that's the good part.
Hit us with the but.
I know that's what you want to hear. the but.
Is your product's right now going through regulatory approval?
It is.
There you go.
It is. I'm fully aware of what a risky situation this is. I did, when I was nominated to this, I think I sent a note to Mickey. I was like, are you all, what is this? Like, why me? This doesn't sound reasonable.
I actually nominated you.
Or Troy. Actually, I also asked you, Troy, why me? I was like, should I be worried? So I think in terms of the opportunity, to me, the opportunity I see is, and this is again coming at it with a fresh pair of eyes into the process, as opposed to say a company like a Novartis or a Roche or a J&J. You know, they've got, they're a massive company. They're tied to the FDA
hit
process.
Us with the butt. Hit us with the butt.
This is me coming at it as a fresh pair of eyes, right? It feels to me like the system, you know, has been around long enough that it needs a little bit of I think there's opportunity to dramatically accelerate the process. So, for instance, it is completely reasonable or expected. It is currently expected that when you're going through a process like this, where you're trying to design a study, it may take you years to do that. And when you're thinking about AI lifecycle development, that is bananas. Like, you can't be sitting there. Like, you know, the current process, for those of you who are not familiar, is effectively you make what's called a sprint, like a submission, and then they review a pre-sub. And then they review what you've submitted, and you're allowed to ask us, you know, a limited number of questions. They review that, then they give you feedback. And then you take that feedback and you adapt it and include it, and then you make a submission again. And they review that and they give you feedback, and depending on the track you're on, you know, it could be 60 days, 90 days. If they're very overwhelmed, it could be more than that. But what that means is, like, and you're able to have that feedback session through a half-an-hour conversation or a 45-minute conversation. And in that conversation, there's only limited exchange that can happen. And they can't, like, affirmatively agree with you on anything. Why? Because the reality is, you know, you're doing this over a 2-year period. So by the end of the 2 years, it's possible the world has shifted. So what they'd agreed to 2 years ago may no longer be relevant. So the process all makes sense in the way it's been developed. On the flip side, if you think about the idea that there's, like, you know, a device that could really make a difference, really improve lives, but you have to now go through this process of maybe in a year you can do 2 or 3 sprint submissions, and you have to do 6 of these or 4 of these if you're in a novel area, because you're educating the FDA along the way to build comfort with what you're doing. And effectively, 2 years later, what you have is maybe a tentative design that maybe you're all comfortable with, and then you sink millions into running the study. And then you go make a submission, at which point the world has shifted again, and you're hoping that what you've done is actually good enough. I mean, this is a huge amount of money, dollars, energy to sink into a process that, like, you know, in terms of, like, what comes out of it. On the flip side, though, it is thoughtful in that it does give extra pairs of eyes to make sure you have a good plan, it's going through well, and it's thoughtful. You know, we think about bias and representativeness and a number of other things. So to me, the opportunity to how can we accelerate? How can we do this in a way so that, you know, like, rather than this feeling like this long drawn process, you know, if there's a way you could, you know, more like we would do, like colleagues that, you know, in academia, like you just walk over to your colleague and you get experts in a room and you have 5 of those conversations real fast, and a month later you have a very sound study plan. Like, can we do that?
So thank you, Suchi, for laying that out. Troy, what's your response to what Suchi's saying about this process and what's effective about it, what's less than optimally effective about it?
I don't know if I want to really respond to the process areas of where we can improve, but I mean, I think there are a few facts that has to be laid out. One is we are operating on a regulation that was actually enacted in 1976. There are issues that we have that don't allow us to have certain flexibilities that Suchi is talking about. And then you have regulatory pathways that people have to fit within in order to get something out that maybe doesn't fit within those regulatory pathways. Again, some of these things are actually, we're very public about the need to have a little bit more of a tailored regulation. So, I mean, these processes were developed for a different type of product, and what we're trying to do essentially is apply a different set of issues to and fit them through a specific process that we're legislated by the government, right? So it's difficult to kind of talk about this. Now, are there areas that we can improve? Sure, and we are looking at things like how do we bring a little more predictability into the process? How do we do early engagement to understand what the product is? So we are trying to extend into and be more proactive in engaging with the market itself instead of a reactive engagement, which is what happens right now. So there are certain things that we can do within the boundaries that exist. And so and we are effectively working on those. But I actually want to talk about something else that you asked, the question that was very interesting and important, and Suchi answered it with sepsis. But Suchi understands inherently, not a lot of developers on this. So sepsis, having a sepsis algorithm doesn't save someone. Sepsis algorithm combined with a workflow management saves someone. Yeah. And so one of the things that I see consistently in the industry is this misunderstanding of how healthcare is delivered. It's about the workflow, and so you can actually build the most amazing sepsis model. If you're not actually responding to an alert, then it doesn't matter. There you go. Thank you. And so I think there is a more important point that I'd like to make is that since we started with bias, and what you're really referring to is that do we actually have the discipline to understand how healthcare is delivered to a patient between a medical professional and a patient? And I think that you have to actually, if you don't understand the industry, you shouldn't be developing a product for it. And, or you could, but it's not going to be adopted. Right, and so I'm from Silicon Valley, and I unfortunately had seen too much of that, right? So,
seen too much of what?
Too much of this idealism around, hey, the healthcare sector was spending 40. Well, first of all, it's an incorrect financial model that people are thinking about. They're going, oh, the U.S. government is spending 40% on healthcare. That's a massive addressable market. But that's not what you're trying to address, right? I mean, you have to look at where healthcare dollars are being spent in. So I think there's that misunderstanding. And then there's this idealism around, hey, we want to do something that is great. And the thing is, I just never seen idealism work as effectively as just essentially tackling something that is going to be very, very specific and is going to move the needle. And I think that industry has to really agree on where the needle needs to be moved towards. So, and I think that is a more important part of what we're trying to do, also working with the industry around how to make sure that prioritization is happening.
And Troy, I want to bring, in one of these 27 background calls that you guys were generous enough to have with us, Suchi brought up this great question. What does, and within this process that she's just outlined, what does success look like for you when it comes to FDA's regulation of AI, specifically around bias? Where are you trying to get the agency to?
Well, so again, if FDA is going to be successful, that means that the industry has to also align on specific things like standards development, best practices, tooling, operational discipline. I always use the example because I don't believe in recreating the wheel. And so this is maybe a bad example, but I mean, PCI certification. Every company who's doing credit card transaction has to go through this certification process on I think it's either annual or every other year basis. And they have controls in there, they have policies, and we have to focus on developing a very, very similar approach towards artificial intelligence as you're dealing with security controls, you're dealing with policies, you're dealing with lifecycle management. So it's not just about what regulation is doing, but we have to really think about regulation is effectively helping with building the parameters to operate within. That's what regulation is. And so it's the rule of the road. And you know, innovation, all of the innovation that Suchi talked about has to actually operate within this rule of the road. It has to operate within a parameter. And I use the example, and it's not the best example, but it gives an idea. Like aviation, if you think about it, there's tremendous innovation happening in innovation, but think about the checks and balances that the aviation companies go through. And I think the healthcare, some of the more, I would say, innovative healthcare companies who are trying to push the boundaries also have to think about innovation within the safety parameters of the risk that they're trying to innovate. And so things like governance, we talk about governance, but governance also has to be multi-layered in the sense that it has to be applied to the risk of the product that you're trying to essentially build, deploy, and operate. And so it's not just about FDA, and this is where, you know, it's a very unique opportunity that the FDA cannot do this alone. And when I say FDA, I'm talking about the government. Government cannot regulate this alone because it's moving at a pace that it requires a very, very clear engagement between the public-private sector. And that's where we've been making a lot of focus on and a lot of investment on to ensure that that public-private partnership is going. We have a set of objectives that we're all not trying to operate independently without a set of objectives, but we're working on really identifying and then agreeing on those set of objectives that we can essentially drive forward.
Suchi, I want to bring you in a second, but I know there's only so much that you can say in a situation like this, so I want to be respectful for that. I say that sincerely, with all due respect. What can the FDA do that it typically doesn't do or has historically not done to make it easier for companies like Suchi's to get these products out under your leadership, under this sort of policy entrepreneurship?
Honestly, I think that's it's not about making it easier for a product. It's about agreeing on a set of standards that one has to use before they even go in to develop the product. I think that if we can agree on a certain standards, agree on a discipline of developing the product, then it makes the process much more simpler.
Can you be concrete about that one?
I mean, again, it is about developing a product with specific guidelines, specific discipline that is a rigor that is associated, or at least it matches the criticality of the product, right? I mean, so we always look at this thing from a risk-based perspective. And so that's how FDA is always looking at products. We look at the risk, and then we determine effectively the review criteria of that based on the risk associated to that. And risk in the healthcare setting is really, it's twofold. It's the depth or the impact that a particular product is going to have, and then there's the breadth of the impact that it can have. And so, you know, in the software world, we call that the blast radius, really. How many people are going to be affected by this if something goes wrong? And so I think that we have to agree on that risk parameter that people want to operate within, and then develop their products, bring their products to the market, and FDA has to use the same risk-based parameter into identifying whether this product is safe and effective. Again, our job is to ensure that products are safe and effective, and I really do believe that it shouldn't just be FDA's guiding principle. This has to be the healthcare's guiding principle, that we have to think about this thing from a safety and efficacy perspective.
Suchi.
I think, Troy, I'd love to hear a little bit more about this public-private partnership. Like, how are you envisioning something like this play out? Like, concretely, like, how can people contribute?
Well, that was planted by, not by me, but I think they worked.
I was just helping Dan out.
I know, right?
You do a better job with this than me, that's true.
How does it work out? So again, I came into the government about 10 months ago, and I came from a company where I had to really work on very clear objectives of what we were doing. And so I'm a firm believer that you have to be very, very clear on the things that you need to go tackle. And so we've been working with Suchi, and ONC has been part of this also with a public-private partnership through the Coalition for Health AI. And what we did was we took a step back about a few months ago and said, okay, let's not think about this thing from an abstract perspective around what we were trying to solve, but more of a, here are the 4 things that we're going to go after. And you have to put a timeline associated to that. And part of this was in order for us to make sure that the industry can benefit from the work that we're all doing within this coalition. And so why this is important, when I came into the government, I think there was like 200 different standards, quote unquote standards organization that were actually developing these AI policies. And so the industry at that point is incredibly confused about where you actually look at. And so the government doesn't develop perhaps standards, but we can say these are the standards that we're effectively evaluating products. And that will drive the behavior that you need, the discipline that you need. And so through the public-private partnership that I just mentioned, what we have been focusing on, those very, very clear objectives that should hopefully move the needle, and that's standards development best practices and operational tooling, which is something that we talk about all the time, which is you cannot deploy these products into a healthcare system without understanding how it's operating once it's deployed.
We're gonna go to audience questions in a minute here, but I want to give each of you a minute to take. What's the big idea that you want to leave this audience with as they go home and they think about things?
I think we're at a very, very critical time. Like, I truly think people don't internalize how much benefit that is right now latent, because it hasn't been exercised, can be had from implementing AI correctly within healthcare. Not just, like, we often talk about bias that AI might introduce, but I actually think in many of my own work and research collaborations we've done, we see enormous opportunity for getting rid of bias that exists today in our current healthcare practice, because human beings are inherently biased. We know that. And so current practice is biased, and we have, with AI done right, we can bring in new objective tools that can eliminate that sort of subtle, subconscious, unconscious bias. So to me, I'm extremely hopeful. Sometimes I get, the work, the opportunity is so exciting. It's easy to work 20 hours a day because it is so exciting. The thing that's sad is when I worry sometimes that I hope we won't go in circles. I hope we will actually truly partner to make progress so we have concrete outputs to point to. And this means, and we've seen a lot of progress in this case in the federal agencies. The partnership over the last year has been exciting, and I think hopefully that only accelerates.
Let me ask you one final question, Suchi. I apologize. What's one thing you want from the FDA that you're not getting from the FDA right now?
I would love it if there was a I can answer that. It's really easy. I would love it if we could go through a very good, rigorous process, but shrink the timeline from what feels like an eternity to 2 months.
Is that possible?
Or 3 months. And without compromising. I don't think we have to compromise on quality to get there.
What do you mean it depends?
Have you never interviewed a government official?
You realize, right, the audience is walking away with, what's the one-liner? It depends.
It depends. There you go. So, by the way, when you join the government, you go through a training, and this is one of the things that they actually, so.
Go ahead.
Can we do that? I mean, of course, that's a very idealistic state. But again, you have to look at, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach here. It really depends on the different products. So it's incredibly hard to say we are going to commit to 2 months for every single product that we have to approve. It's just, let's just be realistic about this, right? So can we have a commitment, which we do? I mean, if you look at some of the things like MDUFA commitments. I mean, we do have commitments around trying to shrink the review cycle by hiring people, more people, right? But again, we're a government, and we do have limitations that we have to have. So I think there's a combination of procedural improvements that we can make, and perhaps look at this thing from a slightly different paradigm. Can we perhaps use initial third-party auditors to review some of these things before it comes to us? These are all the things that we're looking at. But again, it's hard to say that I'm committing to something like that on
Of course. And a process question for you, and then we should turn it to the audience for questions.
Dan, just so you know, I already tweeted that Troy has committed to the FDA process being 3 months. So from what I can tell, this is getting millions of retweets.
So
I've been a liability for FDA since joining, so.
Troy, so you're just a process question. I know federal officials love process questions. You are looking at all of these things. Can you explain why you believe it's really imperative that you're looking at these things?
Well, I think, as Mickey said, I think, was it AI excited? Is that, what was the term? Okay.
AI optimist.
AI optimist, sorry. So we're both optimists and excited about it. But I think through the public-private partnerships and these discussions, we have to be open and honest about where do we start. And what I mean by that is that I'm not an idealistic person, which is interesting. But I mean, you have to be realistic about these things, and you have to look at this thing from a where do we start? Where do you introduce technology that gives the biggest bang for its buck? And I think that we're doing a lot of this stuff to ensure that, one, the industry and we're aligned based on the biggest needs of where technology can be used to solve problems, but also you gotta drive the discipline, and the work that we've been doing has been really focused on operational discipline, technology discipline, and my background was operations, so perhaps this is the only thing that I know, and so therefore I have to essentially take that same tack to say, if you're developing something based on the criticality of the industry that you're developing for, your processes, your development discipline has to match the criticality, the risk associated to that product being integrated into a system. And so I think it's well worth doing this. This is the only way that we're going to essentially be able to take advantage of this technology if you do a couple of things. One is you have this operational discipline, and then you're able to prioritize where you want this technology to be integrated in what order. And so I always use this one metric to kind of really talk to the industry, is that when you have hospital systems operating at 0 to 1% margin, any hospital administrator, anyone who's ever done P&L will understand that you're going to have to be judicious about where you spend your capital dollars. And so that's where I think we have, as an industry, have to align around where do we invest our capital based on the biggest need, and then you have to match also the discipline and the risk management framework based on the product that you're actually bringing to the market. So that's kind of why we're doing what we're doing.
Okay, very good. Thank you both. Let's turn it to you all. We've got, I apologize, we ate into 4 minutes of your time, but I also want to make sure everybody can get out of these seats, go to the bathroom, get coffee or whatever. So we're going to stop the questions in about 5.5 minutes. So thank you for coming up with the question. Please just introduce yourself and keep the question brief so we have time for everybody to get the question.
Sure. Linnell James, Blue Cross Blue Shield Association. From a payer perspective, there's a lot of interest in ethical AI, and I wanted to know more about this this AI coalition. What has it done in this coming year? What is it going to do, given time is of the essence?
Thank you.
Why don't you take that?
Sure, I can take that. So what the coalition's done is basically, there are a few different prongs it's working in. The one it's made the most amount of progress in thus far is putting together a blueprint. So like really bringing groups together from payers, providers, industry, developers, and essentially creating a standard and a blueprint that says, what's the full life cycle, what should we be monitoring for, and when and where, and what should we be measuring. And now what that does is creates a little bit more transparency, because we have 30 or plus odd guidelines, and the idea is, can we harmonize them, keeping a focus on healthcare applications in mind broadly. So that's the first thing, and the next goal is to be able to go from a best practice guide to starting to think about, is there a way we can create, these labs? We call them assurance labs. So the idea of like building, getting individual provider organizations that have the data within their own enclave to be able to take the standard and implement it and demonstrate how it could be used to evaluate products within their own enclave. And if we can do this well, then perhaps there might be an opportunity for a new kind of public-private partnership where federal agencies can partner with CHI and the assurance labs to be able to accelerate or create capacity for our ability to evaluate more products, evaluate them in the real world, and move things forward faster, but also create a learning lab of sorts. I don't know, Troy, would you like to add to that? Because I know this is something really as much, you're just as
from an ethical perspective, one of the things that we're doing is ensuring that these coalitions are very well representative. It's not necessarily just the large AMCs as well as federal government and big tech is involved, but we're making sure that it's diverse with representatives from, smaller companies, HBCUs. We ensure that smaller community center is going to have voice because, what we don't want is this digital divide to keep growing because all of a sudden only large hospital systems can actually afford to integrate these things. And that is also an issue that we're trying to address. So really thinking about this thing from a broader perspective of how do we make sure that there's equity built into the process.
Very good, and that's quick questions, quick answers, so we can try to get us through as many as possible.
Sure, this is Mike Hunter from Leap Orbit. My question is for the FDA, and it is, are you looking at or piloting any solutions to use AI essentially to reduce the timelines while maintaining that rigor? Are there any pilots kind of under consideration for that?
It depends. No, joking.
Awesome.
We are. So one of the things that Mickey covered in the executive order commitment was HHS level improvements that we're thinking about. So review and how do we standardize, understand, like large language models will allow us to maybe summarize something, right? So we are looking at those use cases. But again, these things are fairly new. I mean, the current capabilities that we all talk about have been around since March. And so, but it is actually, we have a governance committee that is looking at this thing from internal modernization process optimization perspective.
Great, thanks. Yes?
Hi, it's Dave Pike from Point Click Care. You've talked about using objective tools to reduce bias that's inherent in the data that you're getting. My question is by using these objective tools, how do you design them to actually reduce the bias rather than just making it far more subtle?
Thank you.
So the tools is meant to essentially be able to actually validate when something has bias and give that feedback to the tool developer for them to essentially acquire more data that allows them to train. So that's the idea behind it. But I mean, again, we have to take this concept of bias and really start thinking about this thing from a computational model perspective. That's what we need a tool to do. These tools don't exist at this point, right? I mean, some people have done certain things, but what we're trying to do is really challenge the industry and academia to actually think about what these tools should do, what the functionalities of these tools should do. Right now, it's still in the early stages of that.
Yep. Here in the middle.
Hey guys, thanks a lot. This is Ricky Sahu, CEO of Gen Health AI, and teasing apart racial bias from the underlying demographics and predispositions of different races and people is actually very difficult because you don't know if a certain treatment plan is necessarily happening because of racial bias or because it's best for that sort of ethnicity. This is a big problem that we have, training generative AI models using transformers on sequences of medical events that we're trying to solve. But I'd be curious to hear how you guys imagine actually determining whether it's a bias or whether it's the right thing to do for that different population because of their genetics.
I can take that very quickly. Yeah. I think that's a great question, and I think this is part of what needs to happen is when you're solving a problem, you're integrating a lot of know-how and context that is well beyond the data, right? So there's medical know-how around this patient population, what is medical knowledge about best practice today, standard of care, what is known. So in other words, is there known knowledge that in this subpopulation we tend to see this, it's prevalent and therefore it's recommended that this treatment has been shown to be effective and therefore people use it more. And that kind of thing, you have to do sort of like grounded reasoning to be able to answer questions like that. You can't ever 100% tease it out, but you can make it much more informed. And this is another reason why when we build solutions, it needs to be close to any monitoring, any tuning, any of these reasoning we have to do has to be really bespoke and close to the solution, because we have to know the full context to be able to reason about it.
Okay, and I apologize that we can't get to all the questions. We're at time. I want to give you guys your opportunity, your break. Let's just give it up for Suchi and Troy here. Enjoy your break, and please be back at 10 o'clock for the next session. Thank you.